Hello and welcome to Coiled. In this video, I'm going to walk through the steps and show you how to switch the Coiled backend to run on your own AWS account. So by default, when you sign into Coiled, all of your Dask clusters are actually created and managed on Coiled's account, but you can switch the backend in Coiled such that all of the Dask clusters that you create and all of the actual work and data access happens on your own AWS account. So let's get started. So when I log in here, there is an account page that has settings for cloud backend options. So here we can see the default backend, default region, and default credentials. So I actually want to switch this over to run on my own AWS account so I can take advantage of any credits I have there or discounts, and also for security reasons. So I can have things happening in my own VPC, accessing my data in S3. So in this case, Coiled is still managing those clusters, but the actual compute and work is happening on my own AWS account. So if I go to the documentation, let's take a look at where the steps are for this. So I can go to backends and I can see the different cloud providers you can run Coiled on. So I'll go to the AWS backend, and this page basically walks through what happens in a default account. So by default, you're using Coiled on your laptop or your cloud training environment, whatever that may be. And any clusters that you launch are going to run in Coiled's cloud account. Alternatively, you can set up Coiled to actually spin up Dask clusters on your own AWS account. This might be useful for security reasons or data access, where you actually want to have things running in your own controlled environment. So let's look at the steps to do that. There's a few steps involved. The first is to obtain AWS credentials. We'll then configure an IAM policy and attach it to a user or role. And then in Coiled Cloud, we'll actually set the backend. And at that point, Coiled will take care of spinning up Dask clusters and provisioning virtual machines, handling software environments using your own Docker image registry and ECR. And at that point, users in your team can basically create accounts, and then everything will happen in your own AWS account. So let's walk through those steps. Step one is to get AWS credentials. Typically, this is done with an IAM user. So I'll go over to the AWS console here, to the IAM section. And in here, you'll find a users tab. So this is a good place where you can add a new user. So here I will add a new IAM user and enable programmatic access so that I get an access key ID and a secret access key. And here, I'm going to skip this portion for now. We'll add the policy in a second, and we'll go ahead and create that user. Great, so we're done there, and I'll go back to this is a good point here where you want to obtain the access key ID and the secret access key. So we'll hold on to that so that we can use them in the Coiled settings later on. So we are done with step one. We have credentials. Step two is to configure the IAM policy. This policy, we include a JSON policy document here. This basically gives Coiled the permissions that it needs to be able to create Coiled clusters, network them together in a private and public subnet, and basically make it so that you can connect to your Dask cluster from a remote location. So that might be your developer's laptop or a VM running in your own VPC. So you can take a look at these. Most of these permissions are related to spinning up and down EC2 instances, attaching roles for IAM, working with the secrets manager. And you'll also notice these are broken up into setup permissions, so things needed during setup, and things needed on an ongoing basis, things like ECR for accessing Docker images for software environments. So what I'm going to do is I'll copy this JSON policy document and go over to policies, and I want to create a new policy. I can use the JSON editor and basically replace what's in there. And let's see, we'll go to the next, and we'll give this a name. All right, and we can create that policy. Great, so we've created a new policy called Coiled Clusters, and we're ready to go on to the next step. So step 3 is to actually tie together the things from step 1, the IAM user, and step 2, the IAM policy. So I'm going to go here and we're going to go into this user, Overholt Coiled, and here I can basically add permissions. And so I can attach directly to policies, and we'll put in coiled clusters policy from earlier. There's different ways to attach these policies to users. Here we're using a very simplistic mapping of here's an IAM user, here's an IAM policy. We're going to map them together. There's other ways that you might do that. So you can adapt these steps to your approach accordingly. Great. So we've attached the coiled clusters policy to our new Overholt coiled user, and we're ready to proceed to the next step. So we're actually done with the AWS part of the steps, and now we're going to go over to Coiled Cloud and switch backends. So I'm going to go over to my Coiled dashboard. You might be doing this in your personal Coiled account, or you might want to do this on your team account. Whichever account you have selected here on the top left, when you go to the account settings, those are the ones that you're actually going to be changing. So be sure that you're on the right Coiled account, that you have the right ones selected. So here, I'm going to go to Cloud Backend Options, and I'm going to click Edit. So I'm going to walk through this configuration steps. And so first I'll select AWS, and I'll select the default region that I want to use when spinning up a Coil cluster. So I'll leave that set to US East 1. And here's the difference here. Instead of running in Coiled's AWS account, I actually want to run this in my own AWS account. So here is where I will get the access key ID and the secret access key from my earlier step. And we'll click Next. And the last question here is related to how a software environment should be stored. So whenever a user builds a conda environment or a pip environment, that will get built as a Docker image. By default, we'll store that in the Amazon ECR registry in your account. So I'm going to go ahead and leave that as a default. If there's some reason that you wanted to use Docker Hub or another Docker registry, you could configure that here. So I'll leave that set to ECR in my account, and we're all done. So I've set AWS as a provider. I'm using the virtual machine EC2 backend. US East 1 is the region. I've provided my own credentials, and I want to use ECR in my account. So at this point, we're going to do some configuration and bootstrapping. If you're doing this for the very first time, this could take 5 or 10 minutes. Basically, Coiled is creating a VPC, private subnets, things like that, AMIs, to be able to quickly spin up Coil clusters later on. I'll show you what that architecture looks like in a second, but at this point, you could wait for this configuration to complete, and then we will proceed to the next step. So that's it. So now anytime that I create a Coiled cluster in my Coiled account, it's actually going to use that backend by default and run things on my own AWS account. So this is actually a good time to test spinning up a Coiled cluster. If you're using a team account, be sure that you specify the account name. Otherwise, it's going to spin up in your default Coiled account, which is probably your individual user account. So either way, I'm going to spin this up in my own personal Coiled account. So let's go ahead and, oops, back that up. Let's start. You can do this in an IPython terminal. You can do this in a Jupyter notebook. Basically anywhere that you've installed, pip installed Coiled. I'll show you that very briefly. In the quick start steps, we walk you through installing Coiled and Dask, wherever it is that you want to drive Coiled. So let's go ahead and do that. So I'm going to spin up a cluster, and here it's telling me that I need to put in a token. If this is the first time you're doing this, you can grab your token from the quick start steps on your Coiled dashboard. So I'll go ahead and paste that token in, save it for next time. So now at this point, Coiled is using the backend that I configured and spinning up a cluster on my AWS account. So while that's happening, I want to jump over to my AWS console. We can go to the EC2 section, and I should see some instances coming up here in a moment. So it looks like the scheduler node is coming up, And you'll notice that I didn't actually have to do anything in AWS. Coiled is handling all of this part for me. Um, it will be creating a scheduler, a VM with a scheduler, and then it'll create a VM or a number of VMs based on how many workers I asked for. So here I asked for one worker, so I would expect to see two VMs come up, one scheduler and one worker. So the cool thing here is they're running on my AWS account. Now, if I connect to this cluster and do some work, which I'll do in a second, all of the communications happening between my laptop and my own VPC. So Coiled is really only taking care of creating, terminating Dask clusters at this point. All of the data access, all of the interaction that I do with Dask is just happening between my laptop and my own private VPC. While this is still creating, I'm going to go scroll a little bit down here and talk a second about the AWS resources that are actually being provisioned right now. So if I zoom in on this, basically what's going on is that we pointed to a region, in this case, US East 1, and then Coiled took care of creating all of the resources that you see here to be able to create one or more Dask clusters on demand. So Coiled created a VPC that will be used for Coiled clusters. All of the networking between Dask clusters happens in this VPC. And the nice thing is you only have to do this once. So Coiled will do this when you create a backend, it'll create a VPC, and then in the future, when people ask for Dask clusters, it'll reuse that VPC. For a particular Dask cluster, there's a VM for the Dask scheduler, and then n number of VMs for Dask workers. So if I asked for a cluster with 10 workers, that means I'll get one scheduler VM and 10 worker VMs. Coiled will take care of all of the networking, NAT gateways, routing, internet gateways to make the cluster communicate and work. So at this point, this cluster could be reaching into S3, accessing data, processing it. All of that stuff is happening in the context of your cloud account. So if I go back to my dashboard, I can see that I have one running cluster, and I see it in my AWS account. At this point, I can also scale the cluster. So let's scale it to maybe 8 workers. And from the client, I said I'd like to scale this cluster to 8 workers. And then the Coil dashboard is reflecting that. And then correspondingly, I should start to see a number of other worker machines come up all automatically. So this is really nice that I can just work with my Coiled API in Python and have all of this other AWS infrastructure, DevOps happening on the back end, right? So those instances are coming up and down. This cluster will get terminated either when I close the connection or it will time out by default after 20 minutes. You can configure that idle timeout however you'd like. And another thing to note is that any team quotas that I've set, if you're working in a team account, there's a total core limit and a user core limit. So those would also be respected to limit what kind of spend and resources you're spinning up on your own AWS account. So let's recap. Let's go back and look at the steps here. So basically, by default, when you sign up for Coiled, all of your Dask clusters will run on Coiled's cloud account. You can switch the backend such that all Dask clusters and compute resources will run on your own AWS account. So if this is something you want to do, you can head to our documentation, docs.coil.io. You can walk through these steps. It's a good idea to do this on your personal AWS account, or you can use a sub account. Anything that you want to be able to test this out, it's great to walk through this process, create an IAM user, create a policy, link them together, and then at that point, it's just as easy as plugging in your credentials to Coil Cloud and managing all of your Dask clusters through there. So if you want to try these out, check out our documentation at docs.coil.io, and you can do this with your own account on cloud.coil.io. So thanks for your time. Hope you found this useful, and I look forward to having you try this out on your own. Thanks.